Stop reacting. Every emotional reaction is a loss of control. Every loss of control hands power to someone else. This audiobook is not about motivation. It is about dominance, internal dominance. Calm people win. Unreadable people decide outcomes. Reactive people stay predictable, manipulatable, and replaceable. If you are tired of being triggered, rushed, offended, distracted, or emotionally exposed, this audiobook will rewire how you think, how you respond, and how you move through pressure. By the end, you will not argue. You will not explain. You will not react. You will dominate, quietly. Chapter 1. Stop letting emotions make your decisions. Emotions are fast. Decisions should not be. This is where most people lose control of their lives, quietly, repeatedly, and without realizing it. They feel something, and they act. Instantly. Automatically. Defensively. They confuse urgency with importance. They confuse emotion with truth. And every time they do, they pay for it later. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. That's the rule. That's the pattern. That's the trap. Anger feels powerful in the moment. Relief comes from sending the message. Satisfaction comes from saying what you really think. But that relief is temporary. The cost is permanent. The reputation damage. The loss of leverage. The weakened authority. The regret you can't undo. You have a choice. Always. Most people never pause long enough to see it. Think about the last argument you had. Not the big dramatic ones, the small ones. The unnecessary ones. Someone said something. A tone. A look. A message that felt disrespectful. And before you even finished feeling it, you responded. You raised your voice. You defended yourself. You tried to set the record straight. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Now think about emails. Messages sent too fast. Words typed while emotions were still hot. Explanations that weren't required. Apologies that weren't earned. Clarifications that weakened your position instead of strengthening it. Once it's sent, it's done. You can't pull it back. You can't reframe it. You gave away control for the comfort of release. That's the key. Emotional reactions are shortcuts. They skip thinking. They skip strategy. They skip long-term consequences. They feel efficient, but they are expensive. They trade future power for present relief. It's not about emotion. It's about discipline. Emotion is information. Discipline is control. You don't eliminate emotion. You outgrow obeying it. Most people don't realize this, but reacting is a habit. And like all habits, it was trained. Somewhere along the way, you learned that expressing emotion quickly made discomfort go away. Speak up. Push back. Explain yourself. Clear the air. But the air never clears. It just gets louder. The people with the least control react the fastest. The people with the most power move the slowest. They pause. They observe. They choose. You have a choice. Let's talk about defensiveness. One of the most expensive emotional reactions there is. Someone questions you, challenges you, criticizes you, and immediately, your body tightens. Your mind races. You feel the urge to correct, justify, prove. But here's the truth. Defensiveness doesn't protect authority. It exposes insecurity. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Every defensive response teaches people where your pressure points are. What you care about too much. What you fear losing. And once they know that, they can steer you. You don't need their permission. You don't need their approval. You don't need to respond immediately to protect your worth. That's the key. Powerful people do something different. When emotion shows up, they don't act. They label. I'm angry. I'm anxious. I'm embarrassed. Not out loud. Internally. Labeling creates distance. Distance creates control. The moment you name the emotion, you separate from it. You stop being inside it. You become the observer instead of the reactor. And in that space, sometimes only a few seconds long, you regain choice. You have a choice. Here is the rule you must train into yourself. No decision is made at emotional peak. None. Not texts. Not emails. Not confrontations. Not commitments. Not exits. Delay is dominance. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Instead, pause. Physically pause. Slow your breathing. Relax your jaw. Drop your shoulders. Your body leads your mind. When you slow the body, the emotion loses momentum. Then ask one question. What response gives me leverage? Not what feels fair. Not what feels honest. Not what feels satisfying. What response gives me leverage? That's discipline. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become precise. You respond when you are clear, not when you are charged. Think about the people you respect most. The ones who command presence without noise. They don't rush to speak. They don't jump to defend. They don't explain themselves into smaller positions. They wait. And waiting changes the dynamic. The other person reveals more. Over-explains. Gets emotional. Makes mistakes. While you stay grounded. You don't need their permission to pause. That's the key. Most emotional reactions are not about the present moment. They are echoes of old patterns. Old wounds. Old fears. Someone disrespects you now, but the reaction comes from 10 years ago. Someone ignores you now, but the emotion is tied to past rejection. When you react automatically, you let the past make today's decisions. That's a bad trade. So you train a new default. Not reaction. Response. Pause. Label. Delay. Say less. Do nothing if needed. Respond later with clarity. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. You will feel the discomfort. That's normal. The urge to act will still be there. That's withdrawal. You're breaking a habit. But every time you resist reacting, you build something rare. Internal authority. And once you have that, external authority follows. This chapter is not asking you to suppress emotion. Suppression creates pressure. Pressure eventually explodes. This is about containment. Control. Channeling emotion into action that serves you. It's not about feeling less. It's about choosing better. You have a choice. From this point forward, your rule is simple. Emotions do not decide. You do. Emotions can inform. They can signal. They can warn. But they do not command. That's the shift. You stop being predictable. You stop being easily provoked. You stop giving people free access to your reactions. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Remember that line. Repeat it. Live it. Because once you stop letting emotions make your decisions, you unlock something most people never experience. Quiet control. And quiet control is the foundation of dominance. You've learned to pause. You've learned to label. You've learned to delay. You stopped reacting. Now you're ready to understand why those reactions existed in the first place. You mastered the pause. Now let's expose the leverage others have been using against you. Chapter 2. Your triggers are your weaknesses. Anything that controls your emotions controls you. That's not an opinion. That's not motivation. That's a law. If someone can trigger you, they can move you. If they can move you, they can steer you. And if they can steer you, you are not in control, no matter how strong, smart, or confident you think you are. That's the key. Most people believe their triggers are caused by other people. Disrespect. Criticism. Rejection. Being ignored. Being challenged. Being compared. Being doubted. That's wrong. Triggers don't come from outside. They come from attachment. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. A trigger is not proof that someone crossed a line. A trigger is proof that something inside you is still exposed. Still sensitive. Still demanding validation, certainty, or control. You have a choice. But you can't change what you refuse to see. Think about what sets you off the fastest. Not the dramatic things. The small ones. Tone. Silence. Someone questioning your competence. Someone else getting attention. Someone moving ahead while you feel stuck. Why does that bother you? That's the real work. Most people never ask that question. They react instead. They defend. They attack. They explain. They emotionally leak information. And every reaction reveals weakness. If it controls you, it owns you. That phrase needs to live in your head. In arguments, the triggered person always loses, even if they're right. The calm person gathers information. The triggered person gives it away. They show where it hurts. They show what matters too much. They show where they can be pressured next time. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Let's talk about criticism. One of the most common triggers. Someone points out a flaw, or questions your decision, or gives feedback you didn't ask for. Immediately, the body tightens. The mind races. You feel misunderstood. You want to correct the narrative. But ask yourself this: why does it hit so hard? Because criticism threatens identity. And anything tied to identity feels dangerous. That's the key. When your self-worth is attached to being right, being respected, being seen as competent, any challenge feels like an attack. And attacks demand defense. But you don't need their permission to stay calm. You don't need their approval to stay grounded. Powerful people separate identity from feedback. They listen without absorbing. They evaluate without reacting. They decide later what matters. You have a choice. Triggers are emotional alarms, not orders. They signal where discipline is needed, where detachment is missing. Jealousy? That's attachment to comparison. Anger at disrespect? That's attachment to ego. Anxiety over silence? That's attachment to control or reassurance. Defensiveness? That's attachment to image. It's not about the emotion. It's about the attachment behind it. That's the key. Most manipulation works by targeting triggers. Not logic. Not facts. Emotion. Media does it. Marketing does it. People do it, intentionally or not. If someone wants to rush you, they trigger urgency. If someone wants to dominate you, they trigger insecurity. If someone wants to distract you, they trigger outrage. If they can speed you up, they can steer you. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. So what do? You stop treating triggers as enemies. You treat them as maps. Every time you feel triggered, ask, what belief is being threatened right now? Not who is wrong. Not how do I respond. What belief? Because beliefs drive reactions. And once you identify the belief, you loosen its grip. You have a choice. Here's the discipline. When triggered, do nothing externally. No message. No reaction. No confrontation. You hold still. You let the emotion rise and fall without action. That's uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the price of control. While you wait, you analyze. You label. You observe. This is anger. This is fear. This is pride. And you remind yourself, this feeling is temporary. Acting on it creates consequences. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Over time, something powerful happens. Triggers lose intensity. Not because people change, but because you do. The same words hit softer. The same situations feel smaller. Why? Because detachment grows. You stop needing to be seen a certain way. You stop needing immediate resolution. You stop needing emotional closure from other people. You don't need their permission. That's the key. The ultimate goal is this: nothing outside of you gets a guaranteed reaction. Everything must earn a response. And most things won't. When you reach that point, people feel it. They don't know why, but they sense it. You're harder to read. Harder to provoke. Harder to manipulate. That's dominance. Not loud. Not aggressive. Quiet. Triggers once ran your behavior. Now they train your discipline. You still feel. But you don't obey. You have a choice. Remember this: every trigger you master removes leverage from the world around you. Every emotional button you disconnect restores control to you. If it controls you, it owns you. But if you can observe it without reacting, you own yourself. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. You've learned to identify the pressure points. You've learned to stop feeding them with reaction. Now it's time to understand the weapon that replaces reaction completely. Calm. Not passive calm. Strategic calm. You've exposed your triggers. Now let's build the state that makes them irrelevant. Chapter 3. Calm is not passive. Calm is strategic. Most people misunderstand calm. They think calm means weak. They think calm means avoiding conflict. They think calm means letting things slide. That misunderstanding costs them leverage. Calm is not passive. Calm is strategic. That's the key. Calm is what remains when emotion is no longer in charge. Calm is the state where you see clearly, move deliberately, and decide instead of react. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Calm does the opposite. Calm feels uncomfortable now and pays you back later, with interest. You have a choice. When pressure hits, you can speed up with emotion or slow down with control. Most people speed up. They talk more, explain more, justify more. They mistake motion for power. But speed reveals insecurity. Slowness signals confidence. Think about high-stakes situations, negotiations, conflicts, leadership moments. The person who rushes to speak is rarely the one in control. The calm one sets the pace. And whoever sets the pace controls the outcome. That's the key. Calm is not absence of feeling. It is dominance over feeling. You still feel the surge, the irritation, the anxiety, the anger. But you don't broadcast it. You don't obey it. You contain it. And containment changes everything. When you stay calm, others fill the silence. They explain themselves. They overcorrect. They reveal motives. Emotional people leak information. Calm people collect it. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Let's talk about tone. When emotions rise, voices rise. That's instinct. But raising your voice never increases authority. It signals loss of internal control. Calm tone does the opposite. It forces others to regulate themselves. When you don't match chaos, chaos looks foolish. When you don't escalate, escalation loses power. You don't need their permission to stay calm. That's the key. Calm is intimidating to people who rely on emotional leverage. They don't know where they stand. They can't read you. They can't push buttons and get predictable outcomes. Predictability is exploitable. Calm removes predictability. You have a choice. Here's the discipline you must train. When tension appears, your body goes slower, not faster. Slower breathing. Slower movements. Fewer words. Longer pauses. This is not natural. It must be practiced. Your body wants to rush. To discharge energy, to relieve discomfort. But every time you slow the body under pressure, you signal safety to the nervous system. And safety allows clarity. That's the key. Calm people think better. They hear more. They make fewer irreversible mistakes. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Look at arguments. Most arguments escalate because both sides react emotionally. Volume increases. Language sharpens. Positions harden. No one is listening. Everyone is defending. But introduce one calm person, and the dynamic shifts. The calm person doesn't rush to respond. They let the other side finish. They pause before speaking. Suddenly, the argument loses momentum. Because calm absorbs chaos. You don't need to win arguments. You need to control situations. That's the difference. Calm is a weapon when used intentionally. But it requires discipline. Because calm feels like losing at first. It feels like giving ground. It feels like not defending yourself. But that feeling is deception. You're not giving ground. You're refusing to fight on emotional terms. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Calm forces others to fight themselves. Think about pressure at work. Deadlines. Demands. Criticism. Urgency. When you react emotionally, you inherit the stress of others. When you stay calm, you force problems to remain external. You respond. You don't absorb. That's the key. Calm is also how you conserve energy. Emotional reactivity is exhausting. It drains focus. It fractures attention. Calm keeps energy centralized. That's why disciplined people appear unshakable. They don't spend energy reacting to everything. They choose where to engage. You have a choice. Now understand this clearly. Calm does not mean inaction. It means delayed action. Chosen action. Precise action. You act when the moment serves you, not when emotion demands it. You don't need their permission to wait. That's the key. The most powerful responses often come later. After emotion has settled. After facts are clear. After you've decided what outcome you want. Reaction closes options. Calm keeps them open. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Here's a practical rule. If your heart rate is elevated, your response is postponed. Period. You don't respond while physiologically activated. You wait until the body settles. This one rule alone will eliminate most self-inflicted damage in your life. Calm is trained, not gifted. You practice it in small moments. In traffic. In conversations. In delays. In minor frustrations. You don't wait for big moments to train calm. Because pressure reveals training. That's the key. Over time, something shifts. Calm becomes your default. People notice. They feel it. Situations that once rattled you now feel manageable. Why? Because you stopped treating emotion as an emergency. You have a choice. Calm is what allows you to be unreadable. It's the foundation of discipline. It's the gateway to silence. Without calm, silence feels awkward. With calm, silence feels powerful. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Remember this, calm is not weakness. Calm is restraint. And restraint is strength under control. Anyone can react. Few can remain calm. And the few always have the advantage. You've learned to stop reacting. You've learned to identify triggers. Now you've learned to wield calm as strategy. But calm alone is not enough. The next level is what you do with it, when you say nothing at all. You stabilized your internal state. Now let's talk about the tool that multiplies its power. Chapter 4. Reactivity is how people manipulate you. Most manipulation doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like urgency. It looks like emotion. It looks like pressure. And it only works if you react. That's the key. People don't need to control you physically to control your behavior. They only need to control your emotional tempo. Speed you up. Agitate you. Make you feel like something must be handled now. If they can speed you up, they can steer you. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Think about how often you are pushed to respond quickly. Messages marked urgent. Demands for immediate answers. Emotional conversations that escalate fast. Social media designed to provoke outrage before thought. None of this is accidental. Reactive people are easy to move. Calm people are expensive. You have a choice. Manipulation thrives on emotional reflex. Not logic. Not facts. Emotion. Once emotion takes over, reasoning shuts down. That's when decisions are made for you instead of by you. That's the trap. The fastest way to lose leverage is to respond on someone else's timeline. You don't need their permission to slow down. That's the key. Let's talk about urgency. Urgency is one of the most effective manipulation tools there is. It creates the illusion that delay equals loss. that if you don't act immediately, something bad will happen. But urgency is often artificial. Deadlines are exaggerated. Consequences are inflated. Pressure is applied to force a reaction before you can think. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. The disciplined response to urgency is pause. Always. When someone pushes speed, you create space. You ask questions. You delay. You refuse to inherit their panic. Calm is resistance. Manipulation also hides in emotional language. Guilt, shame, fear, anger. How could you? You always. You never. These phrases are not about resolution. They are about control. They provoke defensiveness. And defensiveness hands over power. That's the key. When you react emotionally, you confirm that the tactic worked. You show that the button exists, and that it functions perfectly. If it controls you, it owns you. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Look at arguments. The goal is rarely truth. The goal is emotional dominance. Whoever destabilizes the other person wins. That's why people interrupt, raise voices, accuse, bring up unrelated issues. They are trying to break your calm. Because once calm breaks, manipulation begins. You have a choice. Here's the discipline. Never match emotional energy. Ever. You don't mirror anger. You don't mirror urgency. You don't mirror panic. You stay steady. This creates psychological friction. The manipulator loses traction. That's the key. Silence is especially effective here. When someone pushes emotionally and you don't respond immediately, they feel exposed. The tactic loses power. They often escalate, revealing intent, or back down. Either way, you gain information. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Media manipulation works the same way. Outrage cycles. Fear headlines. Emotional narratives designed to keep you reactive, distracted, and divided. The more reactive you are, the easier you are to influence. Calm is independence. You don't need their permission to disengage. That's the key. Let's be clear, not all manipulation is malicious. Many people manipulate unconsciously. They learned that emotion gets results. So they use it. Loudness, drama, pressure. Your job is not to fix them. Your job is to not participate. You have a choice. When you feel emotional pressure, your response is internal first. You notice the urge to react. You label it. And you remind yourself, this is a tactic. Not an attack. Not an emergency. A tactic. That reframing alone restores control. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Then you slow everything down. Fewer words. Lower tone. Longer pauses. You force the interaction onto neutral ground. Manipulation requires momentum. Calm kills momentum. That's the key. Over time, people adjust. Some stop trying to manipulate because it doesn't work. Others reveal themselves more clearly. Either outcome benefits you. Because you are no longer predictable. You don't jump when pushed. You don't rush when pressured. You don't react when provoked. You have a choice. The more emotionally disciplined you become, the fewer people can move you. And the fewer people can move you, the more autonomous you become. That's dominance. Not loud. Not aggressive. Controlled. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Remember this, manipulation feeds on reaction. Starve it, and it dies. You've learned how others try to move you. You've learned how to slow the game down. Now it's time to use the most underestimated weapon of all. Silence. Because silence doesn't just block manipulation, it reverses it. You resisted emotional pressure. Now let's talk about the power most people can't handle. Chapter 5. Silence is a power most people can't handle. Silence makes people uncomfortable. That discomfort is power. Most people speak to relieve tension, not to communicate. They fill space because silence feels threatening, uncertain, exposing. And whoever fears silence gives control to whoever can sit inside it. That's the key. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. When you react verbally, explaining, defending, justifying, you release that pressure. You make things easier for the other person. You tell them exactly where you stand, what you feel, and how to push you next time. Silence does the opposite. You have a choice. Think about negotiations. The first person to speak after an offer often loses. Why? Because silence forces the other side to deal with their own thoughts, their own doubt, their own urgency. Silence makes people reveal themselves. That's the key. In conversations, silence invites projection. People assume. They guess. They fill the void with their own fears and interpretations. And in doing so, they expose motivations they would have hidden if you kept talking. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Most people talk too much because they are afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of appearing weak, afraid of not being liked. So they over-explain. But power never begs to be understood. Silence communicates confidence without a single word. You don't need their permission to stop explaining. That's the key. Let's talk about conflict. When someone is emotional and you respond with silence, you disrupt the script. They expect escalation or defense. When it doesn't come, they lose footing. Silence forces self-reflection or self-exposure. You have a choice. Silence also protects you. Words can be twisted. Tone can be misinterpreted. Statements can be used against you later. Silence cannot be misquoted. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. That doesn't mean you never speak. It means you speak with intention, after thought, after clarity, after the emotional dust settles. Silence buys you time. Time buys you leverage. That's the key. People who fear silence feel compelled to fill it. They apologize unnecessarily. They soften their stance. They concede ground they didn't need to give up. When you stay silent, you let them negotiate against themselves. You don't need their permission to wait. That's the key. Silence is especially powerful when paired with calm. Calm silence signals certainty. Emotional silence signals fear. The difference is internal state. That's why calm was trained first. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. In daily life, silence looks like not responding immediately. Not correcting every misunderstanding. Not reacting to every comment. Not posting every thought. You conserve energy. You conserve mystery. You conserve control. Silence also sharpens your listening. When you stop preparing your next response, you hear more. You catch inconsistencies. You notice patterns. Information is power. You have a choice. Silence also forces respect. People speak more carefully when they know you won't immediately respond. They think before provoking. They hesitate before pushing. Because they don't know what the silence means. That's the key. This is uncomfortable at first. Your instincts will scream to fill the gap. To explain. To smooth things over. To clarify. Don't. Let the discomfort exist. Discomfort is not danger. It's training. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Silence is also how you end arguments without winning them. You stop engaging. You stop feeding emotion. The argument collapses from lack of fuel. You don't need the last word. You need the final position. That's the difference. Silence is restraint. And restraint is strength under control. You have a choice. As you practice this, you'll notice something important. People will project authority onto you. Not because you demand it, but because you don't chase validation. Silence signals self-sufficiency. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Remember this, words are irreversible. Silence keeps options open. Speak when your words increase leverage. Stay silent when they don't. That's the rule. You've learned to pause. You've learned to control triggers. You've learned calm. Now you've learned silence. But silence alone is not the final form. The next step is emotional detachment, the ability to care less about outcomes so you can control them more. You mastered silence. Now let's remove the final emotional hook. Chapter 6. Detach from outcomes to control them. Attachment is invisible pressure, and pressure distorts judgment. Most people lose control not because they care, but because they care too much about a specific outcome. Approval, success, winning, being chosen, being right. That attachment creates tension, and tension creates mistakes. That's the key. Detachment is not indifference. Detachment is clarity. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. When you're emotionally attached to an outcome, every interaction feels heavy. Every delay feels threatening. Every obstacle feels personal. You rush. You push. You overcorrect. And in doing so, you weaken your position. You have a choice. Think about job interviews, dates, business deals, competitions. The moment you need a specific result, your behavior changes. You try harder. You talk more. You sell yourself. You compromise prematurely. Neediness leaks. Detachment hides nothing, but it demands nothing. That's the key. Detached people move cleanly. They listen better. They negotiate better. They walk away when necessary. They don't fear loss because they aren't defined by outcomes. You don't need their permission to stop chasing. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Attachment also creates fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of failure. Fear of missing out. That fear pushes you into reactive behavior. Text sent too fast. Decisions made too soon. Concessions given too early. Detachment removes fear's leverage. You have a choice. Here's the discipline. Focus on process, not result. Execution, not validation. Action, not outcome. When your attention is on what you control, outcomes take care of themselves. It's not about winning. It's about performing correctly. That's the key. Detached people are harder to manipulate. Guilt doesn't work. Pressure doesn't work. Threats don't work. Because there's nothing to grab. If it controls you, it owns you. Detachment ensures nothing does. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. This doesn't mean you don't want things. It means you don't let wanting make decisions for you. Desire informs direction. Discipline determines behavior. You don't need their permission to hold your standards. That's the key. When you detach, you gain optionality. You can stay. You can leave. You can wait. You can say no. Options are power. Attachment narrows options. Detachment expands them. You have a choice. Here's a practical rule. Never negotiate from emotional hunger. If you feel like you need the outcome, you step back. You create distance. You restore balance. Detached minds make accurate decisions. Repeat that. Detached minds make accurate decisions. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Detachment also makes you unpredictable. People can't read your stakes. They don't know what you want badly. And that uncertainty shifts leverage to you. Calm plus silence plus detachment creates authority. That's the formula. Detachment is also how you recover faster. Losses don't devastate you. Wins don't intoxicate you. You stay steady, consistent, disciplined. You have a choice. Most people swing emotionally with outcomes. High when they win, low when they lose. That volatility drains energy. Detachment smooths the curve. Stability is strength. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. This chapter is about releasing the grip, not giving up the goal. You still act. You still pursue. But you're no longer emotionally hostage to the result. You act because it's correct, not because you're desperate. That's the key. As you train detachment, you'll notice something powerful. Outcomes improve. Not because you care more, but because you interfere less. You stop forcing. You stop chasing. You stop leaking leverage. You have a choice. Detachment completes the internal shift. Calm steadies you. Silence protects you. Detachment frees you. Now you're ready for discipline, the system that holds everything together when emotion disappears. You removed emotional pressure. Now let's build what replaces it. Chapter 7. Discipline begins where emotion ends. Discipline is what remains when motivation disappears. That's the truth most people avoid. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel confident. They wait to feel motivated. And while they wait, nothing changes. That's the key. Discipline is not emotional. Discipline is mechanical. It does not care how you feel. It does not negotiate. It does not wait for permission. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Emotion is inconsistent. Discipline is reliable. Emotion rises and falls. Discipline shows up every time. You have a choice. Most people believe discipline is harsh, restrictive, unnatural. That belief keeps them weak. In reality, discipline is freedom. It removes the burden of constant decision-making. When discipline is in place, you don't ask, "Do I feel like it?" You ask, "What's the standard?" That's the key. Emotion asks for comfort. Discipline demands consistency. Think about your daily behavior. When emotion leads, your actions depend on mood. When discipline leads, your actions depend on principle. And principles don't fluctuate. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Here's where most people fail. When emotion ends, they stop. They slow down. They justify. They say, "I'll do it later." That's where discipline should begin. Discipline begins where emotion ends. Repeat that. Discipline begins where emotion ends. You have a choice. Discipline is the ability to act without emotional reward. To do the right thing when no one is watching. When there's no immediate payoff. When it's boring. When it's uncomfortable. That's power. Most people need emotion to move. That makes them predictable. Disciplined people move regardless. That makes them dangerous, in the best way. You don't need their permission to be consistent. That's the key. Discipline also protects you from yourself. From impulsive decisions. From emotional backsliding. From breaking promises you made when you were clear. Emotion says, "Just this once." Discipline says, "Standards don't bend." Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Look at your routines. Or lack of them. Discipline lives in structure. Sleep. Training. Work. Learning. Boundaries. When structure is weak, emotion takes over. Structure is a form of self-respect. You have a choice. Discipline is not about doing more. It's about doing what matters, consistently. Cutting out emotional noise. Eliminating unnecessary reactions. Repeating correct behavior until it becomes identity. That's the shift. You stop trying to feel disciplined. You start acting disciplined. That's the key. Here's a rule. If you only act when you feel like it, you are emotionally governed. If you act because it's required, you are self-governed. Self-governance is dominance. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Discipline also simplifies life. Fewer decisions. Clear rules. Clear boundaries. You know what you do and what you don't do. Clarity reduces anxiety. Anxiety feeds reaction. You have a choice. Discipline is built through repetition, not intensity. Small actions done daily outperform dramatic efforts done occasionally. You don't rise to your goals. You fall to your standards. That's the key. And standards don't care about your mood. This chapter is about replacing emotion with systems. Calm gave you control. Silence gave you leverage. Detachment gave you freedom. Discipline gives you permanence. You are no longer reactive. You are regulated. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Discipline pays later, and it pays consistently. You've removed emotion from decision-making. Now you need to control how much of yourself you reveal. Because discipline without control of expression still leaks power. You built the internal structure. Now let's talk about external advantage. Chapter 8. The unreadable mind always has the advantage. Predictability is weakness. When people know what you're thinking, how you're feeling, and what you're about to do, they adjust around you. They anticipate. They prepare. They position themselves. Unreadable people deny others that advantage. That's the key. Most people reveal too much. Their face reacts before their words. Their tone changes before their position does. Their body language broadcasts insecurity, excitement, frustration, or doubt. And once that signal is sent, it cannot be taken back. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. An unreadable mind does not mean you are deceptive. It means you are controlled. You decide what is visible and what stays private. You don't let emotions leak without permission. You have a choice. Think about social situations, meetings, negotiations, conflicts. The person who shows emotion first loses leverage. The person who remains neutral forces others to guess. And guessing creates mistakes. That's the key. Unreadability creates psychological asymmetry. Others reveal. You don't. Others react. You observe. Others rush. You wait. This imbalance is power. You don't need their permission to stay neutral. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Let's talk about facial control. Your face is the fastest betrayer of emotion. Surprise, disapproval, amusement, irritation. It shows before you speak. Unreadable people train stillness, relaxed jaw, neutral eyes, minimal expression, not stiff, not cold, controlled. That's discipline. You have a choice. Tone matters just as much. Emotional tone invites emotional response. Neutral tone keeps interactions grounded. Calm, professional, detached. You don't mirror energy. You regulate it. That's the key. Unreadable does not mean silent at all times. It means intentional. When you speak, it's measured. When you react, it's delayed. When you respond, it's precise. Words are chosen, not spilled. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Here's what unreadability does immediately. It slows others down. They become cautious. They wonder what you're thinking. They hesitate before pushing. Why? Because they don't know the cost. Predictable people are easy to pressure. Unreadable people create uncertainty. And uncertainty makes people conservative. That's leverage. You have a choice. Most people overshare because they want connection, approval, validation. They explain themselves so others will understand them. But power never explains itself unnecessarily. You don't need their permission to keep your inner world private. That's the key. Unreadability also protects you from manipulation. If others can't read your reactions, they can't calibrate their tactics. They don't know if the pressure is working. They don't know which button to press next. So they either stop or reveal more. Either way, you gain information. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Here's a practical discipline. Respond slower than expected. Not awkwardly slow. Deliberately slow. Pause before answering. Take a breath. Let silence sit for a second longer than feels comfortable. That pause does work for you. It communicates thoughtfulness, control, confidence. You have a choice. Unreadability also means emotional consistency. Big wins don't make you euphoric. Losses don't make you collapse. Your baseline stays stable. People can't read your highs or lows because you don't live at the extremes. Stability is intimidating. That's the key. This doesn't make you inauthentic. It makes you sovereign. You still feel deeply, but you choose when and with whom those feelings are shared. Not everyone deserves access. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Unreadable people are often misunderstood. Others may project arrogance, coldness, distance. That's fine. Projection is not your responsibility. You don't need to be liked to be effective. You have a choice. Remember, Emotional transparency without discipline is exposure. Exposure creates vulnerability. Vulnerability invites pressure. Unreadability closes the door. That's the key. As you practice this, you'll notice interactions change. People speak more carefully. They test less. They push less. They respect boundaries they can't see. Because they can't read you. You are no longer reactive. You are no longer obvious. You are no longer easy. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Unreadability is the external expression of internal discipline. Calm fuels it. Silence sharpens it. Detachment stabilizes it. Together, they form presence. But presence alone isn't enough if you keep giving away power through explanation. There is one final leak most people never close. They talk too much about why. You've mastered control of emotion. Now let's cut off the last escape route. Chapter 9. Most people lose because they explain too much. Over-explaining is a confession. Not of guilt, but of insecurity. Most people don't explain because it's necessary. They explain because they want to be accepted, understood, approved of. They want reassurance that their decision, boundary, or action is valid. But power never begs to be understood. That's the key. Every extra word you add after your point weakens it. Every justification you offer invites negotiation. Every explanation you give hands the other person something to argue with. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Think about how often you explain yourself. Why you're busy. Why you said no. Why you chose one thing over another. Why you feel the way you feel. Most of the time, no explanation was required. You had a choice. You made it. That should have been enough. You have a choice. Over-explaining is usually emotional. It comes from discomfort. Silence feels risky, so you fill it. Boundaries feel harsh, so you soften them. Decisions feel exposed, so you defend them. But every time you do that, you lower your position. That's the key. Explanations turn statements into debates. They signal uncertainty. They suggest that approval is still being sought. And once approval is on the table, leverage is gone. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Look at how confident people speak. Short sentences. Clean answers. No apology for clarity. No rambling to feel safe. They don't say more to be convincing. They say less because they are convinced. You don't need their permission to decide. That's the key. Over-explaining also creates contradictions. The more you talk, the more angles you expose. The more angles you expose, the easier it is for others to poke holes, twist meaning, or question intent. Silence protects structure. Brevity protects authority. You have a choice. Here's a rule you must internalize. If your position is correct, it does not need defense. If it needs defense, it's not as solid as you think, or the other person doesn't matter enough to convince. Either way, over-explaining won't fix it. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. People who over-explain are easy to control. You pressure them, and they talk. You question them, and they justify. You doubt them, and they scramble to restore certainty. That behavior trains others to keep pushing. But when you stop explaining, pressure loses traction. That's the key. Let's talk about boundaries. The moment you explain a boundary, you turn it into a discussion. I can't do that because, invite someone to argue the because. Remove the because. I can't do that. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. Full stop. You don't need their permission. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. This doesn't mean you become rude or dismissive. It means you become precise. You respect your own decisions enough not to dilute them. Clarity is not cruelty. Brevity is not arrogance. They are discipline. You have a choice. Over-explaining is also tied to fear of being misjudged. You want people to see your intentions, to know you're reasonable, to understand your side. But here's the truth. People who want to misunderstand you will do so no matter how much you explain. And people who respect you don't need the explanation. That's the key. Explanation does not create respect. Consistency does. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. When you stop explaining, something interesting happens. People listen more closely to what you do say. Your words carry weight. Because they are rare. You stop narrating your life. You start living it. You have a choice. Here's a practical discipline. Answer the question that was asked, nothing more. Don't preempt objections. Don't soften conclusions. Don't justify decisions that are already made. Say it. Pause. Stop. Silence will do the rest. That's the key. This will feel uncomfortable at first. You will feel exposed. You will feel like you're being judged. That's because you're breaking a pattern of emotional insurance. Let the discomfort exist. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Over time, people adjust. They stop pressing for explanations. They stop expecting access to your reasoning. They accept your boundaries as fixed. Why? Because you trained them. You have a choice. This chapter completes a critical shift. You no longer react emotionally. You no longer reveal triggers. You no longer rush. You no longer explain. What's left is presence. Quiet. Grounded. Controlled. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. You've removed the need to convince. You've removed the need to defend. You've removed the need to justify. Now there's only one thing left to build. An identity that nothing can shake. You've stripped away every leak of power. Now it's time to consolidate it. Chapter 10. Become the person nothing shakes. This is the final shift. Not a tactic. Not a technique. An identity. Becoming unshakable is not about perfection. It's about consistency under pressure. It's about who you are when things don't go your way, when you're tired, challenged, criticized, ignored, or tested. That's where identity shows. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Up to now, you've learned to pause, to control triggers, to stay calm, to use silence, to detach from outcomes, to act with discipline, to remain unreadable, to stop explaining. All of that leads here. Unshakable people are not fearless. They are regulated. They are not emotionless. They are governed. They are not passive. They are precise. That's the key. To be unshakable means your internal state is no longer rented out to external events. Other people don't get to decide how you feel, how you act, or who you become today. You have a choice. Most people live reactively because they never made that choice consciously. They let circumstances dictate behavior. Mood dictates action. Pressure dictates speed. Unshakable people reverse the order. Standards first. Emotion second. Action last. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Being unshakable starts with one principle. Nothing outside of you is an emergency unless you decide it is. Most stress is manufactured by interpretation, not reality. Urgency is optional. Offense is optional. Reaction is optional. That's the key. When something happens, you don't ask, "How do I feel?" You ask, "Who do I choose to be here?" That question changes everything. You have a choice. Unshakable people operate from internal rules. Not impulses. Not opinions. Not approval. Rules. I don't respond when emotional. I don't explain my boundaries. I don't rush decisions. I don't engage in chaos. These rules remove friction. They eliminate debate. They simplify life. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. This identity is built through repetition. Not grand moments. Small ones. Daily ones. Choosing restraint when it's inconvenient. Choosing silence when ego wants noise. Choosing discipline when comfort calls. Over time, the identity hardens. Calm becomes default. Pause becomes automatic. Silence becomes natural. That's the key. Unshakable people don't announce their strength. They demonstrate it through consistency. Others feel it without being told. They don't intimidate. They stabilize. And stability is rare. You have a choice. Being unshakable also means accepting discomfort without flinching. You don't rush to escape tension. You don't need immediate resolution. You let situations breathe. Discomfort is not danger. Emotion is not instruction. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. When others panic, you slow down. When others escalate, you stay level. When others seek validation, you stay grounded. That contrast creates authority. That's the key. Unshakable people don't win every interaction. They don't need to. They win long-term positioning, reputation, trust, self-respect. They don't chase outcomes. They build systems. You have a choice. This identity also protects you from burnout. Emotional volatility drains energy. Regulation preserves it. When you stop reacting to everything, you stop wasting force. Energy becomes focused. Effort becomes deliberate. Progress becomes inevitable. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. To become unshakable, you must also accept that not everyone will like you. Calm will be mistaken for distance. Silence will be mistaken for arrogance. Boundaries will be mistaken for coldness. That's fine. You don't need their permission. That's the key. Unshakable people trade likability for respect, and often end up with both. Because respect grows from consistency, not compliance. You stop trying to manage perception. You start managing behavior. You have a choice. Here's the final discipline. Every time you feel the urge to react, pause and ask, does this response strengthen or weaken my position? If it weakens it, even emotionally satisfying, don't do it. That single question will guide you for life. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. Over time, your nervous system adapts. Situations that once rattled you no longer register as threats. Your baseline stabilizes. You stop bracing for impact because you trust your control. That trust is everything. That's the key. Being unshakable does not mean nothing affects you. It means nothing controls you. You still feel. You still care. But you choose when to act and how. You move through the world deliberately. You have a choice. This audiobook was never about suppressing emotion. It was about ending emotional obedience. It was about reclaiming authorship of your behavior. You are no longer reactive. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer easily moved. Reaction feels good now and costs you later. From this point forward, the standard is clear. When triggered, pause. When pressured, slow down. When provoked, stay silent. When uncertain, wait. When emotional, do nothing. Then act with clarity. That is the identity. That is the discipline. That is how you become the person nothing shakes. And once you are unshakable, everything else becomes negotiable. This audiobook taught you one thing. Power begins when reactions end. You don't need to win arguments. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to respond to everything you feel. Every time you pause instead of react, you reclaim control. Every time you stay calm under pressure, you gain leverage. Every time you choose discipline over emotion, you separate yourself from the crowd. From this moment forward, your challenge is simple. When triggered, pause. When pressured, slow down. When provoked, stay silent. Let others react. Let others explain. Let others lose control. You will not. Stop reacting. Start dominating.